Hello and welcome to the sixth IPQ debate, this time on the China factor, Brussels and Beijing in the age of Trump. I'm Hoff, executive editor of Internationale Politik Quarterly. Today we want to dig deeper into our current spring issue, and I'll post the link to the issue in the chat in a moment, with the help of two great contributors, Helena Legarda and Noah Barkin, who I will introduce in a moment. At IPQ, we are not much into anniversaries, but when talking about the China factor, it's perhaps worth mentioning that this year sees the 50th anniversary of the establishment of relations between China and the European Union. No one seems to be in a festive mood, though. There had been suggestions on the EU side that Chinese President Xi Jinping may pay a visit to Brussels for this year's EU-China summit, but President Xi declined. He will be sending Premier Li Qiang instead. And that's already an improvement on 2024 when the summit didn't take place at all. On the face of it, this is surprising. And what about China is the almost reflexive geopolitical and geoeconomic question for a European continent that finds itself at the sharp end of US President Donald Trump's deluded trade policies and geopolitical unpredictability. As we've tried to make clear in the IPQ Spring issue, there is no simple answer to that question. What about China? But it is definitely still worth exploring further, and we'll do that in this session. I have the great pleasure of welcoming two of our very treasured contributors. With us is Noah Barkin, who is a senior advisor with the Rhodium Group's China practice and a senior visiting fellow in the German Marshall Fund's Indo-Pacific program. Every month, Noah also writes the Watching China in Europe newsletter, which is required reading for everyone interested in what's going on between Brussels and Beijing. In the current IPQ issue, he wrote about Europeans finding themselves between a rock and a hard place. Welcome, Noah. We also have with us Helena Legarda, who is a lead analyst at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, MERIX, here in Berlin. Since we started the column 3 years ago, Helena is also our highly regarded Indo-Pacific Watch columnist. Again, I'll post the link later in the chat. In this column, she regularly writes about China and the Indo-Pacific region and how developments there affect us here in Europe, even breaking the news of the German Navy and Air Force deployment to the Indo-Pacific a year ago. Welcome, Helena. We have about 45 minutes and want to jump right into it with myself putting some questions to our panelists. After some discussion, we'll be opening up for your questions and comments. To join the debate, please raise your virtual hand and I'll invite you to pose your question and comment in person. You're also welcome to use the chat function. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be published subsequently. And without any further ado, let's start with Noah. Could you perhaps describe very briefly the current state of play regarding EU-China relations, Noah?
Well, thanks for the question, Henning, and good to see Helena and Henning. Thanks for the invitation. It's hard to answer this that question succinctly. I'll do my best. I think first a little bit of background. Over the past several years, the relationship between the EU and China has come under growing strain. Two main reasons for that: China's support for Russia, and we can go into more detail about that. And the second is the economic relationship between Europe and China, which has shifted, I think, from what in past decades was certainly from the perspective of a country like Germany, a mutually beneficial relationship, to one of intense industrial competition. And this is not a fair competition. Chinese companies are protected in their home market, and they have also benefited from substantial subsidies as well. So the European market remains largely open, the Chinese market not so open, and so this is a distortion that is disadvantageous to to Europe. So the European Commission, roughly 2 years ago, launched a de-risking strategy, started talking about economic security, started using its trade defense tools more aggressively, and also was cooperating quite actively with the Biden administration on how to respond to China. Now, Trump has thrown a spanner or a wrench in the works, depending on whether you're English or American. And so Europe is adjusting to this new reality of tensions in the transatlantic relationship. It is no longer reacting to the US and coordinating with the US, but worrying about how this relationship with China is going to evolve. Almost in some ways independent from the US policies, which I think we're still trying to understand exactly what the Trump policy towards China is. So to cut to the chase, there is an effort, I think, to reduce these trade tensions that have built up over the past couple of years between the EU and China. There is a summit coming up at the end of July in Beijing between EU leaders and China's leadership. And the question is, can the EU and China arrive at some sort of truce or détente? I don't think we're talking about a grand bargain. And I'm quite skeptical whether a truce can be achieved, because I'm yes, perhaps skeptical that Beijing is going to make the concessions that Europe is looking for. But we are seeing sort of I guess, a bit of a hedging approach in Europe now, because the transatlantic relationship is under such strain. So we'll see whether this actually yields results. But right now, Europe is trying to reduce its tensions with China as much as it can, given the trade tensions and other tensions with the U.S.
Thank you very much, Noah. And let's go straight to Helena. Sort of, what is your view of sort of how Beijing is looking at the European Union at this point? As Noah already sort of suggested, there's a little way of indication that the Chinese are willing to make any concessions, or there's just this sort of repeated openness, so-called, to mutually beneficial relations. But that is where it sort of stops. Is that impression right?
Thank you, Henning, for the question, and of course for the invitation to be here today. So how does Beijing look at the relationship right now? I think they perceive a moment of opportunity. The tensions between the European Union and the United States in the economic and trade sphere, but also when it comes to security, when it comes to digital regulation, when it comes to many other issues, I think have convince Beijing that this might be its moment to reapproach Europe and try and get relations between the EU and China back on track, and to try to bring down some of those trade and other tensions that Noah was referring to. Our sense is that in Beijing, they hope that they can leverage the friction in the transatlantic relationship right now to present themselves as a more reliable partner for Europe than the United States under Trump is. Of course, the ongoing war in Ukraine and China's continued support for Russia is an obstacle here. But Beijing seems to be hoping that because of the economic pain that Europe is going through or will go through as a result of US measures, Brussels and individual member states might be persuaded to leave the whole matter of Ukraine and of China-Russia relations aside in order to focus on improving economic ties between Europe and China. We also shouldn't forget that the Chinese economy is not doing fantastically well at the moment, and the European market is important for Beijing. China's leaders are very keen in preserving China's and Chinese firms' access to the European market, especially as other advanced economies increasingly close down their markets to Chinese products or to Chinese investments. The United States is one of them, but we can also think about Japan or India as other examples. So the EU remains as probably the biggest advanced market that is still almost entirely open to Chinese companies and Chinese investments, and Beijing is invested in maintaining that. The question then is, what is Beijing willing to do to get there? Are they willing to make concessions? Will we see some sort of agreements coming out of the EU-China summit in July? And at this point, I would say that seems relatively unlikely. We are certainly seeing a charm offensive by Beijing and by other Chinese stakeholders across the European Union, and we are seeing some symbolic moves and some signals that China is willing to sort of do something, but they're all minor decisions by Beijing that cost China very little. I think a clear example is the lifting of China's sanctions on members of the European Parliament that was announced recently. This is something that for China, the cost is extremely low, but it's very symbolic. It can create, or Beijing hopes that it will create some goodwill. And I expect that we will see more moves like that. But when it comes to structural changes in how China does economic policy or foreign economic policy, I think that's going to be much more of an uphill battle.
Thank you very much. Back to Noah. You alluded already to the hedging position that you sort of now trying to take, given the state of the transatlantic relationship. How sort of believable though is this kind of hedging? Sort of would the EU really have a sort of China option to embrace a sort of more full and a kind of different kind of economic relationship? Is that really on the cards or in the cards? And what is the Trump administration telling the Europeans? Is the pressure on sort of aligning with the US positions, whatever they may be? You already said it's very hard at this particular moment to really read what the Trump administration actually wants to achieve vis-à-vis China. Do you see this sort of pressure coming Brussels' way?
Yeah, I mean, good questions, Henning. I think, is the China option in the cards? I think, China is no replacement for the United States, including economically. I mean, the European firms have invested much more in the US, and they depend on the US. The German economy, for example, depends on the US more than it does on China. Now, if you look at individual sectors, if you look at the car makers, there may be some exceptions to that. But China is not going to be a replacement for the US. I think what Europe is pushing for is really a rebalancing of the economic relationship to make it put it on a level playing field, a more fair relationship. And I think the focus in the run-up to this summit will be very much on, how can we resolve? China would like to get rid of these duties on electric vehicles that the European Commission introduced in late October of last year. And the question is, what does China have to give in order for the EU to remove these duties? I think the bar is very high here. I think there is talk about minimum import prices for Chinese EVs. There's talk about quotas. I think the European side is going to be pushing for investments from China under European conditions. because the debate about what kind of Chinese investment Europeans want is also growing more intense. We don't want assembly sites that are just putting together final products. We want technology sharing. We want investments that create jobs in Europe that respect our data security and cybersecurity standards. So this is what Europe is going to be pushing for, and the question is China willing to compromise here and offer Europe some concessions? I think up until yesterday, I think, or over the weekend, I think China was under a great deal more pressure than I think the Europeans were. There were U.S. tariffs of 145% on China, essentially a trade embargo. And I think that gave Europe a bit of leverage with China. Now, the U.S. and China have agreed to reduce their tariffs. That may make China a bit less willing to compromise or make concessions to Europe. To the second question, what is the Trump administration saying to Europe on China? Well, I think when the Trump administration came in and was promising to introduce tariffs on Europe, but also other countries, I think there was an attempt to talk to the Trump administration and say, look, we are willing to work with you on China. And from what I've heard from European officials, the Trump administration did not really respond to these overtures. It could do so now. I think the deal that we saw between the U.S. and UK last week, if I remember correctly, there's so many deals at the moment that it's hard to keep track. But that had some economic security elements that were China related in it. I expect the Trump administration will be pushing Europe to take certain measures against China. But I think, it was much easier for Europe to cooperate with a U.S. administration when they knew what was coming, when there was consultations. This happened, as I mentioned, under the Biden administration. Under Trump, there's obviously a lack of trust. Trump is unpredictable. So I think it becomes much more difficult for transatlantic cooperation to move forward, transatlantic cooperation on China to move forward when the Europeans have doubts about what the U.S. policy is. I've been saying in recent months that we may be past the point of peak transatlantic cooperation on China. I hope that's not the case. I think it is important in an ideal world for the U.S. and Europe, G7 plus, to be cooperating on China, but it is going to be difficult with the Trump administration.
Thank you very much. And this sort of a question, just sort of passing it on to Helena. Many people assume that the ultimate goal of China is to loosen the transatlantic relationship, to pull Europe really into the Chinese orbit. As already said, it's a moment of opportunity, and such a situation which Noah has just described would sort of get China closer to this goal, wouldn't it?
It certainly could. I mean, I think it's undeniable that one of China's strategic objectives when it comes to Europe and to the European Union has long been to peel Europe away from the United States and to weaken, if not break down, the transatlantic alliance. This comes across, I think, quite clearly when you look at the readouts of almost any meeting between European leaders and their Chinese counterparts. Simply looking at the readout from the call between Xi Jinping and Costa and von der Leyen just a couple of days ago, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties between China and the EU. this already reading in between the lines comes across. Xi Jinping put forward what he thought should be the road ahead for Europe-China relations, and it's all about how Europe and China should oppose unilateralism and certain countries kind of bullying and defend multilateralism, etc. In the back of all of this, reading in between the lines, what Xi Jinping was saying and what Chinese leaders always say is that they want Europe to distance itself from Washington as fast as possible. This is also what makes Beijing and Chinese officials and Chinese leaders strong supporters of the concept of strategic autonomy, which is, again, a concept that Chinese leaders use quite often in their conversations with the European counterparts. There tends to be a second half of the phrase. So they say that China supports Europe's strategic autonomy, and sometimes they add, so they say the quiet part out loud, and they say with the correct interpretation, right? So again, we're talking about Europe peeling itself away from the United States. I think saying that China wants Europe to be more in its own orbit, I think that might be a bit of a stretch. I think ideally they would like that. I don't think they're under any illusions that they can get Europe to actually be sort of closer to China than it is to the United States, but they don't need to get that far. As long as they can get Europe to operate from their perspective, quote unquote, independently, especially when it comes to China policy and to trade policy, then they will be thrilled. So I think that's the objective. And the reason why I said in Beijing, they seem to perceive a moment of opportunity right now is because I think they see a path, a potential path, right? It's going to be a difficult one, but they see a potential path towards moving closer to this goal without having to change any of their own policies or positions, simply because of what the United States is doing. So instead of China having to attract the Europeans by offering them something, they are simply letting the United States push them away and claiming that they're just waiting there in the background when Europe's ready. There's a whole question here about whether this will work or not, and Noah was referring to some of this. I think it's going to be very difficult. I think Europe is it has a very different approach to China and a very different view of its relations with China and some of the associated risks than it did a few years ago. But I think Beijing is going to try nonetheless.
Thank you very much. We are approaching the time that we usually sort of open up to questions, comments. So if you can have a question, please raise your hand and get into the debate. And while you're perhaps thinking about what you want to ask, quick question to Noah again. How united are the Europeans in their China policy? We saw Pedro Sanchez on a single trip, and this is sort of very typical for how European leaders operate. They sort of show up on their own in Beijing and sort of not always sort of keeping to the line, which is a preferred one in Brussels. And Sanchez in particular was very outspoken in sort of having a more sort of active and closer relationship with China. So yeah, the question really sort of how united are the Europeans, and maybe you can add a sentence of what is your sense of the Merz administration or the Merz government, sort of what's their take on China?
Sure. I mean, Europe is never perfectly united. That is never going to happen with 27 countries. I would argue that we're certainly in a better place than we were a few years ago. And I think there is a sort of core group of countries, France, the Netherlands, Poland, and I hope Germany that will be closely aligned. I think there is a lot of concern, for example, in France about unfair trade practices in China. France was one of the countries that was pushing the hardest for the imposition of duties on made in China electric vehicles. I think and we do have countries like Spain, Sanchez sort of maybe trying to profit from this situation and lean a bit towards China as the transatlantic relationship becomes more strained. But Helena and I have discussed this. I don't think that Spain is going to go against the European consensus when the Commission and sort of a group of larger countries is pushing in one direction. Spain is looking for investment from China. That's pretty clear. But I'm cautiously optimistic. But a lot will depend on Germany and how the new government positions itself. I mean, what I've been saying is that I think the tone is likely to change under Friedrich Merz. He is someone who talks in a sort of clear language, and we've seen that on election evening, for example, when he said that Europe needed to become more independent from the United States. And he has talked a much tougher game on China than his predecessor Olaf Scholz or Angela Merkel before Scholz. So, but I think this is we have this tension, which is the German economy hasn't grown in over 2 years. There is a push to regain competitiveness, to reduce bureaucracy. And there is a risk, of course, that this push is at odds with the focus on economic security and maybe some tighter rules around export controls or investments, that sort of thing. So I'm quite encouraged by the fact that people like Michael Klaus, the former German ambassador to the EU and to China, will be sitting in the Chancellery. Someone who spent 5 years in Beijing and understands China. I don't think we've ever had this in Berlin before, someone like that sitting in the Chancellery. So I think that's positive, but I think the jury is still out on how this government will position itself on China.
Thank you very much. We have one question up, but I wanted just to give Helena a chance to maybe to add to this sort of both on Spain and on your impression of the Merz government, and then we go to Reinhold Brender. But Helena, please.
Not much to add on the new German government. I think Noah covered it quite well. We are seeing some encouraging signals when it comes to sort of the positioning of the new German government vis-à-vis China. I absolutely agree. We will see where this goes. I agree with Noah that there's some inherent tensions between a tougher position on China and some of the economic realities in Germany at the moment. And I think something that we also can't ignore is the fact that Germany's political economy a bit more broadly hasn't changed over the last month or two. So some of these structural factors that used to shape Germany's China policy and Germany-China relations remain in place. So I also would not expect a 180-degree change of position, even with the new government in place. When it comes to Spain, I think effectively what Sanchez is doing and what he tried to do with this visit is what Beijing would like to see more European countries do. Sanchez didn't sort of abandon any of the European positions, right? So if you look at what he actually said, most of it is very much in line with standard EU points on many of the core issues, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's overcapacity, whether it's the unlevel playing field. But he had a very clear agenda, which is to try and secure Chinese greenfield investments in Spain and to try and improve market access specifically for Spanish companies in China, right? As a way to also try to mitigate some of the pain that U.S. tariffs are causing in in Spain. For China, this is ideal. They don't necessarily expect Europe, as I was saying earlier, to completely change position and completely change how it thinks about China. But this rationale of we need to re-engage, we need to reapproach because of economic considerations works for them. So I think for Beijing, this trip was a diplomatic and also an image and sort of narrative win. Whereas for Sanchez, yes, he did secure some deals, but it was, again, nothing huge and nothing structural. I think that the concern from my perspective is whether more European leaders and more member states try and follow a similar path, and then we might actually see some of the unity that we've had in Brussels, even if limited, but some of the unity we've had on China policy start to fray. I completely agree with Noah, as he said, we've discussed this a couple of times in the past. I don't think Spain will ever sort of stick its neck out and go against EU positions, but the moment you get critical mass of countries that think similarly, we're in a very different ballgame. And I think that is kind of more the concern rather than this particular trip by Sanchez.
Thank you very much. Let's go now to Reinhold Brender, please, and introduce yourself, please, before you put your question to the panel.
Yeah, good afternoon. Many thanks, first of all, for setting this up and the very interesting comments we already had. My name is Reinhold Brender. I'm a former European Union official, and I've been working on Asian issues in the External Action Service until 2 years ago. And I'm now affiliated with the Belgian Institute for International Relations, Egmont. I wanted to report, I want to make a comment and ask a question. My comment is to say we had yesterday in Brussels a pretty big meeting organized by Egmont and also the Belgian Academy for Overseas Sciences on the EU-China relationship. 50 years old, what are the perspectives? And we had a pretty large delegation from Beijing there, from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, the Institute of European Studies. They were there in full strength. And I wanted to report that the Director General of this institute, and that goes very much is very much in line with what has been said before, there was really a charm offensive underway, I would say. You know, we were told by the Director General, Europe has lost the United Kingdom already. It has lost Russia, and it is about to lose the United States. This is how it was presented. And so we are, as China, are ready to work more closely with you. That was overall the comment. And on the substance, there was no concession whatsoever. I would say it was all about establishing the correct perceptions on our side and having a lot of dialogue so that we would get the right perceptions. Now, my question is, I would be very interested if you allow me to zoom out very much for a second and ask you a very broad question, which I think is a bit under investigated in general. You know, there is a lot of discussion on a possible intention of the United States to work with Russia, basically to have free hand in dealing with China. So my question is, we have this MAGA ideology in the United States now, and we have the great rejuvenation approach in China by President Xi being pushed. And great rejuvenation is make China great again, I would say. My question is, what are the ultimate objectives on the one hand, as far as you can say, because Trump is very difficult to read, and it's very difficult really to get into his mind and to know whether he has any ultimate intention. But to the extent you can read his mind, if possible, what is the ultimate intention of the US in dealing with China? Let's assume they get the free hand and can deal with China one day more freely than they can for now still. What would they wish to achieve globally? And what on the Chinese side is really the ultimate intention? Again, insofar as you can say a word on this, of President Xi and the Chinese leadership at this point. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's hear also from Mihai Gabriel Crainicu. Apologies for the pronunciation.
My name is Mihai Gabriel Crainicu. I have studied political science, international relations, and European studies as a bachelor degree at the University of Bucharest, and a master degree in security studies, and in another master degree in business intelligence. I am now an editor at the Link in Politics online publication. And I have a question in relation to this presentation. So, given the growing strategic reach of China through the string of pearls theory, so to say, and the Belt and Road Initiative, how should Germany and the European Union recalibrate its foreign policy to balance this economic cooperation with the need to uphold geopolitical autonomy and normative values in the regions increasingly influenced by the Chinese infrastructure and investment? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to round off this already quite big round of questions, there's a more detailed one in the chat by Linus Hingst, who's asking whether the lifting of sanctions on the side of China on MEPs, whether it includes serving ones or everyone who was put under sanctions, including Reinhard Bütikofer, who is no longer an MP, but I think still under sanctions. But our experts will know that better. And whether the EU is in a position or is thinking about lifting its sanctions on I think the party chief on Xinjiang province, for instance. Who wants to go first? And take your picks if you go along when you go.
Well, maybe I will leave China's intentions to Helena and take on the thankless task of sketching out what Trump's ultimate intention is, and then we can move on to the other questions. I think there is a tension within the Trump administration. Trump is very transactional, as we know. I think I've been struck in his first months by how conciliatory he has been in his public statements towards China. He invited Xi Jinping to his inauguration. He has talked repeatedly about the great deal that he wants to strike with China. We did have a deal over the weekend, which was announced on Monday. I wouldn't classify this as a great deal. It basically took us back to where we were on April 1st, before we were all liberated. I think my assumption and that of my colleagues at Rhodium Group is that we are going to have a bit of a dance that takes place between Trump and Xi Jinping, and that we will have an attempt to negotiate some sort of deal. We had this in the first Trump administration, which resulted in the phase one trade deal. I think by no one's imagination a sort of comprehensive economic agreement. It was more of a managed trade deal. So I think that's probably the best that we can hope for, and that fairly soon, and I don't know if it's this year or next year, we return to a more confrontational track with China. The Trump administration is pushing ahead with tighter export controls, tighter restrictions on technology sharing with China. So my assumption is that we will return to a more confrontational track once this dance between the U.S. and China has taken place. Very quickly on the other questions, maybe I'll leave BRI to you, Helena, and I'll skip to the MEPs. Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that the lifting of the sanctions was only applied to sitting members of the European Parliament. There were 4 MEPs that were on the list who are still in the parliament. The 5th, Reinhard Bütikofer, I believe is still on the sanctions list. At least that's what he's told me. And organizations like Merrick's, where Helena works, is still on the list. Now, I don't see any potential for a removal of the EU sanctions related to Xinjiang. I think the EU has made very clear that this is not on the cards. But I think what we may see, I think China has signaled a certain amount of flexibility to people who are on the sanctions list, that maybe these sanctions won't be implemented, and you're free to travel to China. Now, if you're on a sanctions list and you have not been officially removed from that list, are you going to be willing to go to China and test this promise? That's up to individuals to decide. But I think this is a small symbolic step, and it does not transform the relationship in any way. It's perhaps a signal that China is willing to make these small steps, but I don't think it necessarily signals that China is gonna move on the big issues that I talked about earlier, that Europe really cares about.
Thank you very much, Helena.
Thank you, Henning. And maybe just something quickly to add to what Noah said on this question of the sanctions. I believe a spokesperson for the EAS already confirmed a couple of weeks ago that for now the EU has no plan of lifting the sanctions on Chinese officials, because they haven't seen the conditions in Xinjiang province improve substantially. So the basis for the sanctions remains there. So I believe the EAS already confirmed this towards the end of April, if I remember correctly. But moving on to the first question about China's ultimate objectives, I will not touch upon Trump's. I think Noah did a good job at least trying to explain those. But when it comes to China's, I think the beauty about China's ultimate strategic objectives is that they're relatively well defined. What we are a bit unsure is about how they plan on getting there and what this might look like in the end. But the ultimate objective, Beijing's strategic objective as defined by Xi Jinping, is to achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, or the China dream, by 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the People's Republic of China. What does this China dream or this great rejuvenation entail? It effectively refers to returning China to its rightful place at the center of the global order. I think that the perspective of the Chinese leadership, of the Chinese Communist Party, is that China was for centuries, if not millennia, according to CCP historiography, at least a regional power, but at times also a global power. And it is an anomaly that it wasn't for about 100 or 150 years, ever since what they call the century of humiliation. So China deserves to go back to that spot, and they are working towards that. And this is a goal that expresses itself very differently across all policy areas. So this implies that China wants to be a global tech superpower, that wants to be one of the most advanced, scientifically advanced nations, that wants to have a world-class military that can fight and win wars, that wants to have a more advanced, more resilient economy, that is also more sort of self-sustainable and less dependent on Western value or supply chains. So again, in every policy area, this looks very differently, but effectively, that's what Beijing wants to do. It wants to equal, if not surpass, the United States in terms of global power and influence. Again, what this looks like afterwards, right? So another expression of this goal is China wants to reform the current rules-based international order so it's more aligned with its own sort of values, principles, and interests. We don't know exactly, or rather this would be sort of another interesting but a bit nerdy debate to be had, what a Chinese-dominated global order would look like, right? So that's a whole other question, but that's where they want to get to. They want to be the United States of the second half of the 21st century, basically.
Then we will have a clash.
Sorry?
Then we will have a clash, probably, yeah?
We might.
Yeah.
We might. I don't think it's something that is a done deal, and that it is absolutely certain. I don't subscribe to the theory that a war between the United States and China is inevitable. But if trends continue as they are, I think there will be more and more friction between the US and China, and to be honest, between Europe and China. Whether we find ways to resolve those, or whether a clash eventually takes place, I think that's still an open question. And when we look at Taiwan, for instance, or the South China Sea, I think those are sort of potential hotspots where we are seeing the frictions reach a bit of a high point sooner than in other policy areas. But again, it's not the only space. I mean, if we think kind of further down the line, and I'll shut up now, Henning, I know that we're at time, but if we think about this whole question or this issue that Noah was talking about, right? Sort of the trade tensions between the EU and China, the question of overcapacity and the impact that has on the European economy. If this worsens, the impact on Europe is just going to increase and increase, and so is friction, right? So when we talk about clash, it doesn't necessarily have to mean a hot war, but there will be more and more friction as China tries to sort of take that role in the global order, because I think we have to understand, but also acknowledge and accept that we have very diverging, not just values, but also principles and interests in certain issue areas. And friction will emerge, even in areas where we don't see it just yet. So what we need to find the way to do is to control and mitigate those and try to prevent escalation. But we need to get comfortable with tensions and with friction. I think there's very few ways around those.
Thank you very much. I was thinking of sort of a quick concluding question. You already sort of answered it in a way, Helena. Sort of in the theoretical event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, where would the Europeans find themselves, or where would we find the Europeans sort of positioning themselves? Are they still sort of strongly to expect it at the US side, or is there a little element of unsecure sort of unpredictability? Just know your sense in 2 sentences.
I think the sort of we talk about a conflict. I think it depends very much on the nature of that conflict, and because we often talk about Taiwan in sort of black and white terms, invasion or no invasion. I think the more likely scenario is a sort of a salami slicing, growing pressure from China on Taiwan. And then the question for Europe is, how do you respond to these steps that are not as obvious? Maybe a ship is being stopped in the Taiwan Strait, etc. So I think I am a bit worried about where the Trump administration is going on Taiwan and some of the signals that have been sent out. And I think, as I said before, transatlantic cooperation, I think, becomes more difficult when when there's a lack of trust and a lack of clarity on what the policy is in Washington. So, I think Europe should be bolstering its ties with Taiwan, growing engagement, growing economic engagement, growing dialogue. But I think ultimately it will depend on where the U.S. ends up, and we don't know for sure where that is.
Thank you very much. Helena, last word, just one sentence or two.
On the Taiwan question, you asked Henning whether we would find Europe aligned with the United States or not. I think we would find Europe aligned with Taiwan. I have more question marks about sort of how the US might respond. Europe would be aligned with Taiwan. And then there's a second layer to this question, which is what could Europe realistically contribute in terms of capacity, in terms of capabilities, and what would it be willing to contribute, politically speaking? So I don't think we will see Europe send military assets to Taiwan in case of an open conflict. But there's many other things that Europe can contribute in the economic sphere when it comes to sanctions, when it comes to political and diplomatic support, etc. Will Europe be willing to do all of this in a certain setting in which perhaps the United States is less involved in case of a Taiwan conflict? I think that's another question that we're going to have to watch. I think a lot of this will be highly dependent on circumstances, on the type of conflict we're talking about, just like Noah mentioned, and honestly speaking, on who is in power or in positions of leadership, both in Washington but also in Brussels and in other European capitals.
Thank you very much. And on this rather gloomy note, I say thank you to our two panelists, Helena Legarda and Noah Barkin. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Keep an eye out on the next issue of IPQ, which will be dealing with a world order with a United States less prominent or maybe even missing in action. So with that, I wish you all a very good day and see you soon. Or hope you keep reading IPQ and see you all very soon. Thank you very much.